I have built things with my hands for 51 years, barns mostly, farmhouses when the work was there, a grain store for the feed merchant on the Dunning Road, one church that still stands in Broken Bow, though the congregation that filled it has mostly gone on ahead of me, and I expect to follow them before too long. I have cut more board feet of lumber than I could calculate on a winter evening, and I have made enough mistakes in that time to fill a second ledger alongside the work itself. My granddaughter asked me last week what the most important thing was that I ever built. I sat with that question for a while before answering, the way a man sits with a question when he knows the honest answer is not the comfortable one. The most important structure I ever helped build is one I did not design, did not fully understand, and, if I am going to be straight with you about it, which is the only way I know how to tell a story at this age, did not believe would work. I have been a carpenter for 51 years. That embarrasses me still. I want to tell you about a woman named Ingrid Halverson. I want to tell you about her now, in the winter of 1921, because the people who were present for what she did are dying faster than the stories are being written down, and because there is an agricultural pamphlet sitting in the Territorial Extension Office Library that describes, in reasonable technical detail, a method of earth and livestock construction that Ingrid Halverson developed in the autumn of 1885 in the Nebraska Sand Hills. And that pamphlet does not contain her name anywhere in its 11 pages, not once. I wrote 2 letters about that. Neither received a reply, so I am telling you instead. To understand what Ingrid built, you need to understand what she was building against. And to understand that, you need to know something about the Sand Hills that most people who have not lived there do not know. From a distance, from the seat of a wagon coming west along the dismal river in late summer, the Sand Hills look forgiving. The grass is deep and the hills roll in long, gentle curves, nothing like the sharp, broken country further west, and the creek bottoms run with enough water to give a man the feeling that the land is offering something. Men looked at that grass and calculated cattle per acre. Women looked at the creek and calculated kitchen gardens. Everyone looked at the mild September afternoons and made decisions that September afternoons in Nebraska have no right to authorize. The Sand Hills are not forgiving. They are patient, which is a different thing entirely. The winters come down from the northwest without much warning and without any particular interest in what you have built or how carefully you built it. A frame barn that kept 40 head of cattle comfortable through 3 ordinary winters could fail on the 4th, not because the barn had changed, but because the 4th winter was not an ordinary one. The Sand Hills reserve their worst for the years that fall outside what experience has taught you to expect, and experience on the frontier is always a few years shorter than it needs to be. The settlers who were pushing into the valley through the early 1880s were capable people. I want to be clear about that because this story is sometimes told as if the neighbors were fools and only Ingrid was wise, and that is not what happened. August Reimer had been farming the Sand Hills since 1869. He ran 400 acres with a precision that other men studied and tried to replicate. His barn was properly built, properly chinked, properly supplied. Per Lundgren's dairy operation along the East Creek was the most productive in the valley. Carl Engel had broken his acres with borrowed oxen 12 years before and built something from that beginning that any reasonable man would have called a success. These were not foolish people. They were people who had learned from the winters they had survived and could not be taught in advance by the winters they hadn't. Ingrid Halverson had learned from a different set of winters entirely. She had come over from the Telemark region of Norway in 1874, sailing steerage to New York with her husband Eric and their 2 children, following the land grants that were pulling Scandinavian families onto the Great Plains the way a tide pulls everything in the same direction, whether it intends to go or not. Eric was a capable man, not remarkable, but solid and honest and reliable in the way that matters most in a place where reliability is the difference between a farm and a ruin. He had built them a sod house near the dismal river in the early years, then later a proper frame farmhouse when the money allowed, and by 1882 they had 3 milk cows, a team of draft horses, 40 acres of hay ground, and a mule he had named Barrett after his grandmother, which told you something about both the mule and the grandmother. Eric died of pneumonia in February of 1882. Not dramatically. He came in from the barn with a cough he had been carrying for a week, went to bed, and did not get back up. By the time the ground thawed enough to bury him, Ingrid had been running the claim for 6 weeks, with her son Lars at 17 and her daughter Astrid at 15, and she had already understood, with the particular clarity that grief sometimes brings to practical matters, that she was going to have to rethink nearly everything. Lars was old enough to do a man's work. He was not old enough to replace one, not yet, though he grew into it faster than was entirely fair to ask of a boy that age. Astrid helped through that first season and the next, but she was a girl who belonged in a schoolroom, and Ingrid knew it. And in 1884 she arranged for Astrid to board with a family in Broken Bow during the school terms. It cost more than she had comfortable, and she did not regret it. What I want to tell you about is not the hardship of those years. Every family on the frontier had hardship, and Ingrid Halverson was not a woman who dwelt on hers. What I want to tell you about is what she was thinking during those years, which is something different from what she was enduring. She was thinking about the winters, not worrying about them, thinking about them. There is a difference, and it matters to this story. She had grown up in Telemark, watching her grandfather maintain the farm's winter barn, not a frame building set on the surface of the ground, but a structure carved into the hillside above the village, backed into the slope, so that the earth formed one wall, and the roof and the hill took the worst of what winter sent down from the north. She had helped her father there as a girl, carrying water and hay in the early mornings before the valley below had warmed at all. She remembered the temperature inside that barn. She remembered it specifically, the way children remember the things that surprise them. It was warm, not heated stove warm, not uncomfortable, just steady even. The kind of warmth that seems to come from everywhere at once, because it comes from the earth itself, which has been storing the slow heat of 10,000 summers in the rock and clay beneath your feet, and gives it back through a winter without fanfare and without running out. She had never forgotten that temperature, and in the winters after Eric died, lying awake listening to the frame walls of the farmhouse flex and crack in the cold, she found herself returning to it the way a person returns to a memory that contains an answer they have not yet finished extracting. She told me once, we spoke about it the spring after the hard winter, when she came to my yard for lumber for an addition, that she had spent 2 years turning the idea over before she committed to it. Not 2 years of doubt, 2 years of thinking it through from every direction, the way a careful builder thinks through a joint before cutting it, because a joint cut wrong costs you a board, but a structure built wrong costs you everything. The winter of 1884 into 1885 was the one that decided her. It was not the worst winter she had seen. It was simply a winter that should not have been as difficult as it was. The cold came 3 weeks early and caught her hay stores short by a margin she had not expected, and she spent January rationing carefully, watching the cows lose condition in the frame barn while the temperature outside turned the water in the trough to solid ice between morning and afternoon. She did not lose any animals. She came close enough to understand that close was not a permanent condition, that close got closer every winter until one year it became something else entirely. In March of 1885, when the thaw came and the cows went back to pasture, looking thinner than they should have, Ingrid walked the north ridge of her property for the first time with the specific intention of choosing a site. She was looking for a south-facing slope with the right combination of things: stable soil beneath the surface grass, a natural drainage line that ran away from the slope rather than into it, enough hill above to provide the depth she needed, and an orientation that would let the open face of the structure catch what winter sun the sandhills offered without letting the north wind straight through. She walked the ridge for 2 days. She rejected the first 2 sites, one for drainage, one for soil, and chose the third. Then she spent the summer preparing. She wrote to her brother in Norway, a timber framer in the Telemark Mountains, and asked him specific questions about load-bearing ratios for earthen roofs and the joinery that held best under the pressure of compressed soil above. He replied with dimensions and specifications that she annotated in the margins of his letter and later transferred to her own drawings. She read 3 pamphlets from the Territorial Agricultural Extension Office, 2 of which were more useful than the third. She dug a series of test pits on the chosen slope over the course of a July week, small holes, nothing that announced itself to a passing neighbor, and left a tin cup with a strip of wet cloth inside each one overnight, measuring the temperature at different depths the following morning with a thermometer she had ordered from the mail catalog in Omaha. At 2 feet, the ground held 51 degrees on a July night when the surface temperature dropped to 64. At 4 feet, it held 53 degrees. At 6 feet, 54. She recorded these numbers in a small notebook and sat with them for an evening. Then she wrote down the number that mattered, 38 degrees. The minimum temperature at which a healthy bovine can maintain its own body heat without external supplement given adequate feed and dry conditions. She had read this in one of the extension pamphlets, which had gotten that particular fact right. 53 degrees at 4 feet of depth, in July. She already knew from the Norwegian winters of her childhood that the ground temperature at depth did not change dramatically between seasons, that the Earth's mass absorbed the extremes of both summer and winter and held to its own steady middle. The July reading was not the winter reading, but it was close enough, and the principle was sound, and the principle was what she needed. She closed the notebook and went inside to make supper. Lars was 19 that autumn. He was a quiet boy, a quiet young man, I should say, because at 19 on a frontier claim you are something past a boy, whatever the calendar thinks. He worked alongside his mother without requiring explanation of every decision, which was itself a kind of intelligence. He had his father's steadiness and his mother's capacity for attention, and he did not waste either one. When Ingrid showed him the drawings in late August, the cross-section of the hillside, the timber frame dimensions, the drainage specifications, he studied them for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "How deep is the hay storage?" She showed him. Below the main floor, accessible through a trapdoor, a lower chamber carved directly from the ridge. He looked at the depth and the calculated volume and worked out silently what she had worked out when she designed it. The space was built for more animals than they currently owned. He did not ask about the difference. He understood it was not an accident. He picked up his coat and went out to begin marking the excavation. The first person in the valley to hear about what Ingrid was building was not August Reimer. It was Henry Reimer, his son, who was 23 that year and rode the creek road past the Halverson North pasture on his way to the Dunning feed store in early September. He saw the excavation from the road, the rectangular cut into the hillside, the stacked sod blocks beside it, Lars working in the pit with a spade, and he slowed his horse and looked for a while before continuing on. He mentioned it at the feed store in a tone that was more puzzled than contemptuous. "The Halverson widow is digging something into the ridge up on her north pasture. Can't tell what she's after." By the end of the week, most of the valley knew. August Reimer heard it from his wife, who had heard it from Per Lundgren's wife, who had heard it from the feed store. He did not ride out to look, not then. He was a man of 60 who had learned to let peculiar things reveal themselves in their own time rather than going to meet them. He mentioned it to Per Lundgren the following Sunday after the church service in a tone that settled the matter before either of them had examined it. Eric Halverson was a sensible man, he said. His widow is grieving, and it has been 3 years, and grief takes people in different directions. Per Lundgren nodded. He had cattle to get back to. Neither of them rode out to look at the drawings. I did. But that comes later. And what I found when I looked is the part of this story that I have been trying to tell correctly for 35 years. For now, you need to know only this. In the autumn of 1885, while August Reimer was pronouncing judgment from the road, and Per Lundgren was nodding and riding home to his dairy cows, Ingrid Halvorsen and her son Lars were on their hands and knees in a cut hillside, fitting sod blocks into walls that had no business standing and would stand for 40 years, and asking a question of the Nebraska earth that nobody in that valley had thought to ask before. Not what can you give me? What do you already know? I should tell you how I came to see the drawings. It was not through any particular wisdom on my part. It was because Ingrid Halvorsen needed white oak in 20-foot lengths, and white oak in 20-foot lengths was not something every lumber yard in the Sandhills carried as a matter of course. She had written to 2 other suppliers before she came to me, and neither of them had what she needed in the dimensions she specified, and she came to my yard in Dunning on a Thursday morning in early October with a piece of paper in her coat pocket and the particular manner of a person who has already done the work and is now simply acquiring the materials the work requires. She was a tall woman. I remember that first, not her face, which came to me later, but her height and the way she carried it, without apology and without the slight forward lean that tall women sometimes develop in rooms built for shorter people. She had the kind of fair Scandinavian coloring that the plains wind weathers quickly, and her hands, when she spread the paper on my counter, were a working woman's hands. Not rough from neglect, but worn from use, which is a different thing. She placed 2 sheets of paper on the counter. The first was a cross-section drawing of a hillside with a rectangular space cut into it. Inside the rectangle she had drawn, in careful pencil, the outlines of cattle. 4 of them standing with the comfortable posture of animals that are not cold. The second sheet was a timber frame specification with dimensions written in a column down the right margin. The numbers were precise, not approximate, precise to the 1/4 inch. I looked at the drawings for a long time without speaking, which is something I do when I am trying to understand something rather than simply react to it. Then I asked her where the primary load-bearing members would sit. She pointed to the drawing and explained. Vertical posts every 4 feet along the side walls, mortised into a base plate set on compacted clay. Horizontal crossbeams at 8 feet, notched to the posts. Ridge pole running the full 40-foot length of the structure, supported by 3 intermediate posts down the center line. The earth above would bear on the ridge and crossbeams, which would transfer the load down the posts to the base plates, which would distribute it across the floor. I ran the numbers in my head the way a carpenter runs numbers, not with a pencil, but with the accumulated memory of things that have held and things that have not. The frame was sized correctly. More than correctly, actually. She had overspecified the ridge pole by perhaps 15%, which I learned later was deliberate. She had calculated the load of a saturated earthen roof, the worst case, the heaviest possible condition, and built to that, not to the dry condition figure that would have been cheaper and probably sufficient. I asked her what she intended to place above the frame. She explained the roof assembly in sequence, the way a person explains something they have thought about carefully enough that the sequence itself has become the logic. Pine planking across the crossbeams, then a layer of tar paper she had ordered from Omaha, then 4 inches of dry clay mixed with fine gravel, then living sod laid grass up in courses running from the eave to the ridge. I asked about moisture. The tar paper was the answer, she said. But the tar paper alone was not sufficient. The exposed timber ends at the wall junctions needed to be treated with pine pitch before assembly. She had tested this. She had buried a pine sample and a pitch-treated pine sample side by side in the test area in July and pulled them both up in September. I asked if she had the test samples. She produced them from her coat pocket. I examined them. The untreated sample had begun to show surface darkening along the end grain. The pitch-treated sample was unchanged. I set them on the counter and looked at her. She was watching me with the patient expression of someone who anticipated this examination and prepared for it in advance, and was now simply waiting for me to finish. I sold her the white oak. What I did not fully understand that morning, what I did not finish understanding until the following spring, when I stood in the completed structure with the smell of old earth around me and the temperature a steady warmth against my face in March, was what the structure was actually doing. So, let me tell you what Ingrid understood that I did not. The earth is not cold. That seems like a strange thing to say in a story about surviving a sandhills winter, but it is the center of everything she built, and it is worth sitting with for a moment. The surface of the earth is cold in winter, because the surface exchanges heat with the air above it, and the air in a Nebraska January is very cold indeed. But that exchange, that conversation between the earth's surface and the winter air, does not reach very deep. At 4 feet below the surface, the earth has absorbed the slow, accumulated warmth of every summer in its memory, and it holds that warmth with the particular stubbornness of something that has been doing the same thing for a very long time without anyone asking it to stop. Ingrid had measured it. Her test pits in July had read 51 degrees at 2 feet and 53 degrees at 4 feet. What she also knew from the Norwegian winters of her childhood was that the ground temperature at depth does not change dramatically between seasons. The Earth's mass is simply too large to be moved quickly by a single winter or a single summer. By January, the reading at 4 feet would be somewhat lower, perhaps 40 to 42 degrees, but it would stay there. It would not follow the air temperature down to 30 below or 38 below or whatever the sandhills decided to demonstrate in a given year. 40 degrees. The minimum for bovine survival, given feed and dry conditions, was 38. She had 2 degrees of margin, and the animals themselves would add to it. 3 cows and a mule generate heat continuously, and in an enclosed earthen space that heat does not dissipate into a winter sky. It accumulates, adding to what the earth is already holding, creating a warmth that is greater than either source alone. This is what the Norwegian FGOs had always known. This is what Ingrid's grandfather had built into a hillside above a telemark village before she was born, and what she had walked into as a girl and felt as a physical fact rather than a principle. The earth is not cold. The earth is steady. And steady in a sandhills winter is everything. The excavation began on the 15th of September. Lars had spent the previous week cutting the site boundary into the sod with a spade, marking a rectangle 30 feet wide at the hillside face and running 40 feet back into the slope. The sod in the sandhills is not ordinary topsoil. It is a dense, root-tangled mat that has been building itself for longer than anyone can accurately estimate, layer upon layer of grass roots binding the sand beneath into something that behaves more like soft stone than like dirt. It resists a spade the way a living thing resists a cut, not with hardness exactly, but with a fibrous tenacity that makes every foot of progress a negotiation. Ingrid had designed the sod removal to serve 2 purposes simultaneously. The blocks cut from the excavation would become the side walls of the structure, stacked grass side down in the method that had built half the homes in the territory. She cut them to a uniform size, 14 inches long, 12 inches wide, 4 inches thick, using a template Lars had made from scrap pine. Uniform size was not for appearance. It was for predictable compression. When sod blocks of consistent dimension are stacked and allowed to settle under their own weight, they bond into a mass whose behavior can be calculated. Irregular blocks settle irregularly, and irregular settlement in a load-bearing wall is how walls become problems. I did not know this at the time. She explained it to me the following spring. The first 6 feet of excavation took 11 days. The upper soil layer was the most difficult, root-tangled, resistant, full of stones that had no business being that far from any geological feature that could have put them there. Lars pulled stones the size of his knee from the first 4 feet of depth, each one requiring careful levering to free without destabilizing the cut face above it. His hands blistered in the first week and wore through the blisters in the second, and he wrapped them with strips of flour sacking and kept working. Ingrid worked alongside him every morning until the heat of the day, then again from mid-afternoon until dark. She had the farm's other work to carry as well: the cows, the kitchen garden, the endless maintenance of a claim that did not pause because its owner was building something, and she organized her days with the economy of a person who has learned that rest is not optional and is therefore not wasted. She slept when she said she would sleep. She ate when she said she would eat. She did not borrow from those hours to add to the working hours because she had done the arithmetic and understood that a body run short is a slower body, and a slower body extends the calendar past the window she had. The calendar mattered. The Sandhills frost could arrive as early as the first week of October, and she needed the structure enclosed, roof on, floor packed, door hung, before the first hard freeze. A structure not yet enclosed when the ground froze solid became a much more difficult problem than a structure built before the freeze, because frozen ground does not accept the drainage adjustments and floor leveling work that the final stage required. She calculated, until approximately the 10th of October. She had started on the 15th of September. Below the 6-foot mark, the soil changed. The root tangle ended, and the dense Sandhills clay began, a material entirely different in character from what lay above it. Where the upper soil fought the spade, the clay accepted it cleanly, parting in smooth cuts that held their edges without crumbling. It had a smell that I can only describe as ancient, not unpleasant, nothing like rot, but the smell of something that has been undisturbed for a very long time and is mildly surprised to be disturbed now, damp without being wet, patient without being inert. Lars noticed the change first. He called up to his mother, who was working at the wall face, and she came down and pressed her palm flat against the newly cut surface and held it there. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "This is what I was looking for." It was, in fact, precisely what she had been hoping to find at this depth. Dense clay compresses under weight rather than collapsing. It does not crumble from a cut face the way sandier soils do, which meant the walls of the excavation would hold their shape during the construction phase without requiring temporary shoring. It also sealed against water movement in the way that well-fired pottery seals, not perfectly, nothing underground is perfect, but well enough that the drainage system she had designed would handle the remainder. The drainage system was, I think, the most elegant piece of engineering in the whole structure, and also the piece most likely to be overlooked by anyone looking at the finished barn because it was underground and invisible. She had laid it out on paper before breaking ground: a French drain, a trench packed with gravel, running along the entire uphill wall of the structure, collecting any groundwater that seeped through the clay, and directing it to a clay pipe that ran at a slight downward angle through the base of the ridge, emerging 30 feet east of the barn face to drain into a low area of the pasture. The clay pipe she had made herself. Her father had been a potter in Telemark. She had helped him from the time she could reach the work table, and she had not forgotten the work. She built a small field kiln from stacked stones in early August and fired the pipe sections over 3 days, testing each one by filling it with water and watching for seepage before accepting it. Lars had watched this process with the expression of a young man who is storing the memory carefully because he suspects it will matter later. He was right. It mattered considerably. By the 22nd of September, the excavation was complete. The space was 30 feet wide, 40 feet deep, and 12 feet from floor to the highest point of the cut ceiling, which followed the natural slope of the hillside rather than being leveled flat. Ingrid had designed it this way deliberately. A sloped ceiling meant that the ridge pole, when installed, would sit at the highest natural point and provide a clear drainage path for any moisture that condensed on the roof's interior surface. That evening, after Lars had gone inside, she stood alone at the entrance of the excavation with a lantern. The space was not yet a barn. It was a wound in a hillside, raw clay walls and a dirt floor and the smell of deep earth. but it held the temperature she had measured in July. She stood in it without a coat and felt the difference between the air inside and the air outside, which that September evening was running cold from the northwest, carrying the first suggestion of what was coming. She stood there for a while. Lars told me later, this was the spring after the hard winter, when we sat on the bench outside my yard and talked the way men and boys talk when they have been through something together, that he had come back outside to find her standing in the entrance like that, lantern in hand, not moving. He said he had almost spoken. He had been carrying a question for 2 weeks that he had not found the right moment to ask. Not a question of doubt exactly, but a question that lived near doubt, the way a fence line lives near the property it marks. They had worked 11 days through root-tangled soil and come out the other side into clay. And the drawings matched what was here, and the temperature was what she had said it would be. But the roof was not yet on. The frame was not yet cut. The October frost was coming, and the window was closing, and the question he had been carrying was simply, what if the one thing we haven't tested yet is the thing that doesn't hold? He stood at the entrance of the excavation and looked at his mother standing in the lantern light inside it. And he did not ask the question, not because he was afraid to, not because she would have dismissed it, but because he looked at her standing in that space she had measured and planned and calculated and dug with her own hands, and he understood that the question had already been asked by her months ago from every direction she could think to approach it, and that she was standing in the answer. He went back inside. He cut the first timber the next morning before she was up, working by feel in the dark barn until the light came, because the window was closing and they both knew it, and there was nothing left to do but build. The timber frame took 9 days. I know this because Lars told me, and Lars was the kind of young man who remembered durations the way a carpenter remembers them, not as a matter of sentiment, but as data, the way you file away how long a particular joint takes to cut, so that the next time you plan for it accurately. 9 days for the primary frame of a structure 30 feet wide and 40 feet deep, built by 2 people with hand tools in an excavated hillside in early October, with the frost arriving earlier than the calendar had any right to allow. I had delivered the white oak to the claim on the 1st of October, hauling it out myself on the lumber wagon because the lengths she had specified required a long bed haul, and I wanted to see the site. I told myself this was professional diligence. The truth is closer to what I admitted at the start of this account. I could not find the mistake in her drawings, and I wanted to look at the ground itself to see if the ground would tell me something the paper hadn't. The ground told me nothing I could argue with. The excavation was clean and precise. Walls cut at a consistent angle, floor leveled to within a degree of horizontal, the drainage trench along the uphill wall already packed with gravel, and the clay pipe seated and sloped. I walked the perimeter of the space with the lantern Lars handed me and looked at the clay walls the way I look at any structural surface, for inconsistency, for the small variations that become large problems when load is applied. I found one. A section of the eastern wall, perhaps 6 feet from the entrance, where 2 courses of stacked sod blocks had not bonded cleanly, leaving a horizontal gap that ran nearly 4 feet before closing again. I pointed it out to Lars. He said his mother had already identified it. I asked what the repair plan was. He showed me a wooden bucket near the wall containing a mixture of wet clay, fine sand, and dried grass cut short. A slurry, essentially, thick enough to pack but thin enough to work into a gap with a flat stick. Ingrid had mixed it that morning. The repair method was to pack the slurry from both faces of the wall simultaneously, allow it to dry to the point of surface firmness, then pack again, building up the repair in thin layers so that each one had time to bond to the sod before the next was added. Rushed, it would crack as it dried. Done in layers, it would cure to something close to the hardness of the surrounding material. I knew this technique. I had not known that she knew it. I unloaded the lumber, checked the dimensions against her cut list, found them correct, and drove back to Dunning. I thought about the drawings the whole way home, not about whether they were right. I had stopped doubting that somewhere between the drainage pipe and the slurry repair. I thought about the specific quality of preparation they represented: the test pits in July, the pine pitch samples, the field kiln for the drainage pipe, the cut list accurate to the quarter inch. There is a kind of preparation that comes from worry, which is exhausting and often misses the point. And there is a kind of preparation that comes from thinking, which is systematic and almost never misses anything. I had been building things for 26 years by that October, and I had learned to recognize the difference. Her drawings were the second kind. The timber frame began with the base plates. These were the horizontal members that would sit directly on the packed clay floor and receive the vertical posts, the foundation of the frame's logic, the element that everything else depended on. Ingrid had specified white oak for the base plates as well as the ridgepole, which was an unusual choice. Most builders used pine for secondary members, reserving expensive hardwood for the primary load-bearing elements. She used oak throughout the ground contact framing because oak resists moisture absorption at the end grain better than pine, and end grain was where the base plates would be most vulnerable, set as they were directly on compacted earth. Lars had cut the base plates the morning before I arrived, working by feel in the pre-dawn dark, as I mentioned. He had measured twice in lamplight the night before and cut once in the early morning, which was the method his mother had taught him, and which is, whatever else you might say about it, the correct method. The plates were true. I checked them with my own square before I left, not because I doubted his work, but because I needed to know whether my square would agree with his measurements, and it did. The posts went in over the first 3 days. Vertical members 4 inches by 6 inches, white oak, set into mortises cut into the base plates and braced temporarily with pine stakes until the crossbeams could lock them in position. The mortise and tenon joinery Ingrid had specified for all primary connections was more labor-intensive than the iron spike connections most sandhills builders used, but it distributed stress across a larger surface area and, critically, it allowed the frame to move slightly under load without losing integrity. A frame connected entirely with iron spikes is rigid until it fails. A mortised frame is somewhat flexible, and flexibility, in a structure that will experience the shifting and settling of frozen and thawed earth through many winters, is a form of strength. The crossbeams required the most precision of any element in the frame. Each one had to be cut to a length that fit exactly between its 2 supporting posts. Too short, and it would not transfer load. Too long, and it would not seat into the post mortises. Ingrid had specified a tolerance of 1/8 of an inch. Lars cut to this tolerance. I know because I measured 3 of the beams myself on my second visit to the site, on the 7th of October, and all 3 seated within the specified range. On that visit I also heard for the first time what Ingrid had taught him about listening to wood under load. She was fitting a crossbeam into position when I arrived, Lars at one end, Ingrid at the other, both of them lifting together and seating the tenons into the post mortises simultaneously. Once the beam was seated, she put her hand flat on the top surface and pressed downward. A sound came from the joint, a short, low creak, single-noted, almost musical. She nodded. Then she pressed again, harder, from a different position along the beam. A different sound, longer, with a slight roughness in it, like a note played on a string that is not quite properly tuned. She looked at Lars and said, in the Norwegian she used when she wanted precision, "Hear the difference." He pressed the beam himself, first position, then second. He listened with the focused expression of someone being handed a skill they understand they will need. She told him, "The first sound is a beam accepting weight and distributing it correctly through the joint. The second sound is a beam beginning to tell you something. Not failing, not yet. Telling you. A joint that tells you something deserves attention before it tells you louder." I stood at the entrance of the excavation and listened to this lesson being given in Norwegian in a half-built earthen barn in the Nebraska sandhills. And I thought about the apprentices I had trained in my years of carpentry, and whether I had taught them to listen to wood the way this woman was teaching her son, and the honest answer was that I had not with that precision, and I had been doing it longer. The roof assembly began on the 12th of October. By this point, the frost had come twice. The first time, on the 7th, it silvered the grass along the creek bottom and killed the last of the kitchen garden's late growth and left by mid-morning. The second time, on the 10th, it stayed until noon, and when it left, it did not leave entirely. It retreated to the north-facing slopes and the low ground near the water, where it sat in thin white patches through the afternoon like a thing that had decided to wait rather than withdraw. Lars noticed the second frost. I know this because he mentioned it to me on the 7th when I was there, not the frost itself, which anyone would have noticed, but the specific patches that remained in the afternoon. He had been watching the north-facing slopes and the low ground all autumn, the way young men watch things that their mothers have told them to watch, and he had a developing sense of what the frost patches in the afternoon meant for the frost patches in the evening and the night following. He mentioned it to Ingrid when they stopped work at midday. She looked at the north slope and looked at the roof frame, which was perhaps 2 days from ready for planking. She said, "Then we work until dark." They worked until dark. The pine planking went across the crossbeams in overlapping courses, each board face-nailed to the beam below and edge set tight against its neighbor. This was the secondary roof deck, not the structural element, which was the oak frame below it, but the surface on which everything above would rest. It needed to be tight and true, because any gap in the planking deck would become a channel for moisture to find its way to the tar paper below, and any failure in the tar paper would find the timber. The tar paper went on in a single long session on the 14th of October, both of them on their knees on the sloped roof, working from the eave toward the ridge and overlapping each course 6 inches over the one below, pressing the material flat against the planking and weighting the edges with stones until the clay layer above could hold it. The wind had come up from the northwest that morning, not hard enough to stop work, but persistent enough to make every light piece of material a problem to control, and Lars spent as much energy preventing the unrolled tar paper from folding back on itself as he did positioning it. They finished as the light was going. Ingrid stood on the slope above the entrance and looked at the tar paper surface running from eave to ridge, and then looked at the sky above the ridge, which had taken on the particular flat gray quality that the sandhill sky gets when it is not threatening weather so much as describing weather that is elsewhere yet, but is aware of this location and will be paying attention. She did not remark on the sky. She went inside and ate supper and went to bed. The clay and gravel layer went on the following day, mixed at the entrance, and carried in wooden buckets to be spread across the tar paper in a consistent 4-inch layer. This was the most physically demanding single day of the construction, and Ingrid worked it alongside Lars without rest between loads, because the clay had to go on while it still held workable moisture. If it dried too much before spreading, it would not compact evenly, and uneven compaction in the insulating layer was how frost found its way through. By the end of that day, her hands were the red of a person who has been working wet clay since before sunrise, and she moved with the particular economy of someone operating at the edge of what their body will give without complaint. Lars worked the same way. They did not speak much. The work required attention rather than conversation, and they were both the kind of people who gave work what it required. The sod cap went on over 2 days following, laid in courses running from eave to ridge, grass side up, each block set tight against its neighbors and pressed firm into the clay layer below. By the time the last course reached the ridge, the barn had acquired from the outside the appearance of a hillside that had always been there, slightly more regular than a natural slope, with the squared entrance cut into its face, but from any distance already beginning to read as landscape rather than construction. The door went up on the 19th of October. It was a plank door, tight-fitted and iron-hinged, hung in a timber frame mortised into the entrance posts. Ingrid had salvaged the iron hardware from the original sod house Eric had built their first year, which had been taken down when the frame farmhouse went up. The hinges were heavy and good, and the door, when Lars swung it closed for the first time, seeded into the frame with the sound of something fitting correctly, a sound a carpenter recognizes the way a musician recognizes a chord resolved. Ingrid stood inside the completed structure and looked at it. Lars stood beside her. The temperature inside on a morning when the air outside was running at 31 degrees was 41. Neither of them said anything for a while. There was nothing to say that the thermometer had not already said. The first person in the valley to change his mind about the barn was not August Reimer. It was Per Lundgren. He did not change it visibly, or announce the change, or present it to anyone as a change. He changed it in the private way that careful men change their minds, by going back to the original objection and finding, on examination, that he could not remember what had seemed so convincing about it. He had predicted ice damming on the earthen roof, water accumulating behind the sod cap during a freeze-thaw cycle, pressing against the structure's face, finding ways in. He had said this to his wife in the kitchen, not to Ingrid directly, because Per Lundgren was not the kind of man who delivered his doubts to the person whose work he was doubting. In late October, after the second hard frost, he rode the creek road past the Halverson North pasture and looked at the roof. The sod cap was dry. There was no ice accumulation at the eave line. The entrance face showed no moisture staining along the timber frame. He sat on his horse and looked at this for a moment and then rode on. He mentioned it to no one. But that evening he walked his own barn, a well-built frame structure, properly chinked, with a good roof and adequate ventilation, and he stood inside it in the November air and felt, without entirely meaning to, the difference between the temperature inside his barn and the temperature he had stood in 2 weeks prior, when he had stopped at the Halverson claim on another errand, and Ingrid had been inside and left the door open for the moment it took her to step out. He had felt it then. He had not named it then. He named it now, standing in his own barn. Her barn was warmer. Not heated warmer, differently warm, as if the warmth came from a source that did not diminish, that did not depend on the barn holding against the cold so much as on the cold simply not being present at that depth. He named it and set it aside. His hay stores were full. His frame barn had kept cattle before. The winter ahead would be like the winters before it, more or less, and his preparation was sound. This is what he told himself in November of 1885, standing in his frame barn with the first serious cold moving in from the northwest. He was a careful man, and he was wrong, and he would not know he was wrong until there was nothing left in his dairy operation to be wrong about, and by then the knowing would be the least of it. The winter of 1886 into 1887 did not announce itself differently than other winters. That is the thing I want you to understand before I tell you what it did. There was no particular sign in October that separated it from the October before it. The geese went south on schedule. The creek froze at its edges in the normal sequence. The first snow came in November and behaved like November snow, present, then gone, leaving the ground harder and the light flatter, and the general feeling that the season had officially begun and would proceed in the direction seasons proceed. It was December that changed the accounting. The snow that came in December did not leave. It came on a northwest wind, and it stayed, and then more came on top of it, and the wind that followed compacted it into a crust that the cattle could not break through to the grass beneath. This is the particular cruelty of a hard sandhills winter, not the depth of the snow, which is manageable, but the crust, which turns every pasture into a surface that looks like forage and provides none. Cattle stood in their fields burning through their fat reserves, while the grass they needed was 4 inches below their hooves, and the crust would not give. August Reimer moved his herd to the barn in the second week of December. He had done this before in hard Decembers, and it had served him. He had hay. He had a sound structure. He had 16 years of Sandhills winters in his memory, and he applied what those winters had taught him with the competence they had earned. Per Lundgren's dairy cows stayed in his frame barn as the temperatures fell. fed from stores that had seemed in October more than adequate. December became January. I will not give you the temperatures in January as a list of numbers because numbers do not carry what January of 1887 actually was. What I will tell you is that I did not leave Dunning for 8 days in the middle of that month, and I am not a man who stays indoors easily. I will tell you that the water in my shop, which was a heated space, froze solid in the bucket on the 14th. I will tell you that the sound the cold made at night was not wind exactly. It was something beneath wind, a pressure, as if the air itself had decided to become a solid and was in the process of doing so. Per Lundgren lost his dairy cows on the night of the 17th. He did not lose them to any single failure. The frame barn held, the roof did not collapse. The walls did not give way. What happened was simpler and more absolute. The temperature inside his barn fell below the threshold that mattered, and it stayed there for long enough, and his cows were already weakened from 6 weeks of hard winter, and the combination was sufficient. He walked out at dawn on the 18th and found them. I will not describe what he found. He walked out and he found them, and he came to Dunning 2 days later when the cold had lifted slightly and sat in my shop for an hour without saying much, and I did not press him to say more. He had 6 cows in November. He had a draft team in January. That was the arithmetic of the 17th. Carl Engel had been watching his cows for 10 days before he drove to Ingrid Halverson's claim. The signs had started in early January, the roughed-up coats, the standing still that cattle do when they are conserving heat rather than feeding, the youngest animal off her grain for 3 days running. He knew these signs. He had seen the beginning of them before and managed his way past them with extra feed and extra bedding and the careful attention of a man who understood what his dairy operation meant to his family's future. He managed for 10 days. On the evening of the 22nd, he came inside from the barn and sat at the kitchen table without removing his coat. Hattie was 7 months along with their 3rd child, and she had been watching him come in from the barn each evening for 10 days with the particular attention of a woman who has learned to read what her husband's posture says before he speaks. She set a plate in front of him. He looked at it and did not eat. She sat down across from him and said, "How many days?" Not a question exactly, a way of locating them both in the situation accurately. He said, 2, maybe 3. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Mrs. Halverson's barn." He said nothing. She said, "I thought about it in October. I should have said so then." This was not a reproach, it was an offering, a distribution of the weight, so that what he was about to do would not have to be carried as entirely his failure. He looked at her across the table and understood what she was doing and accepted it in the way that people accept things that cost the giver something real. He said, "I'll go in the morning." She said, "Go tonight." 2 days is not a comfortable margin. He went that night. It was 31 degrees below zero when Carl Engel tied his team at Ingrid's porch and knocked. She opened the door with a lantern. She looked at him and looked past him toward his wagon and looked at his face, which told her what she needed to know about the urgency before he spoke. He said, "Mrs. Halverson, I have 6 dairy cows that will not last the week in my barn. I am asking whether you have room." She held the lantern up slightly, not to see him better, but in the unconscious way a person raises a light when they are thinking. She asked him one question before she answered. "How much hay do you have left?" he told her. Perhaps a third of his original store, he thought, though the consumption had been running higher than calculated because cold animals eat more. She ran the number against her own stores, still more than half full, the insulated lower chamber having kept the hay dry and dense through the entire winter, losing nothing to the moisture rot that had damaged stores in less protected structures across the valley. She ran the number and found it sufficient. She said, "Bring them now. Lars will come with you." She turned and called Lars, who appeared from the back room already pulling on his coat because he had heard the knock and heard the voices and had been pulling on his coat since the knock. He was on his horse before Carl Engel had turned his wagon. The drive took 2 hours. Lars rode alongside the cows in the dark, talking to them in the low, continuous murmur that he had learned from his mother, who had learned it from her father, a sound that is less about the words than about the steadiness of a voice that the animals have learned means nothing dangerous is present. 2 of the cows were stumbling before they arrived, not falling, but carrying their weight with the careful placement of animals whose legs are telling them something they do not want to hear. Ingrid had warm water ready, heated on the kitchen stove, and carried in covered pails to take the shock off animals that had been drinking water cold enough to drop their core temperatures further. She moved through the barn with the lantern, checking each animal as it came in, her hand on their sides, feeling for the trembling that meant the cold had gone deep. All 6 were standing by mourning. I do not say this lightly. 2 of them should not have been, by any reasonable calculation of what 31 below zero does to an animal already compromised by 6 weeks of hard winter. They were standing because the barn held 40 degrees through the night, and 40 degrees plus dry bedding, plus warm water, plus their own combined heat was enough, barely, to pull them back from what the frame barns across the valley were delivering to their animals that same night. Carl Engel came back at first light to help with the morning feed. He stood at the entrance of the barn and looked at his 6 cows standing and eating in the warmth, and he did not say anything for a long time. Ingrid was measuring out hay from the lower chamber's reserves. She did not make him speak. She handed him a portion and gestured to the far stall and let him do the work of feeding his own animals, which was the kindest thing she could have done for a man in his position, because useful work is a better remedy for that particular feeling than any conversation. He helped with the morning feed. He came back every morning for the rest of the winter. The thaw came in March, slowly, the way the sandhills allow thaws, tentatively, 1 degree at a time, as if the cold is not entirely persuaded that it has finished its business. The valley took stock of itself the way communities take stock after a hard thing, quietly, in private, and then in the accumulated conversations of people comparing what they had lost against what they had held. August Reimer had lost 11 of 30 cattle. His dairy herd was intact. His operation was reduced but viable, held together by the quality of his preparation and the particular stubbornness of a man who had built something and was not inclined to watch it fail without a fight. He was diminished, and he knew it, and he carried it without complaint, which was consistent with everything else about him. Per Lundgren had his draft team and his land and his family, and nothing that produced daily income. He began the spring the way a man begins a spring after a loss of that kind, by calculating what is left and what can be built from it, because the alternative to that calculation is not available to a man with a family and a mortgage and 40 acres that will not wait for him to finish grieving. Carl Engel's 6 dairy cows calved in April. Hattie's 3rd child was born in March, a boy healthy. Ingrid Halverson's 3 cows came through the winter in better condition than they had entered it. The hay stores in the lower chamber were still a quarter full in March. The barn's timber frame had not moved. The sod roof had produced 1 small crack along the western edge where a freeze-thaw cycle had worked at the seam between 2 courses. Already identified by Ingrid, already repaired with the clay grass slurry, she kept mixed and ready through the winter for exactly this purpose. August Reimer came to see the barn in May. He came alone on a Tuesday without announcement. He stood at the entrance for a long time before stepping through the doorway. He walked the perimeter of the interior. He pressed his palm against the sod wall. He looked at the timber frame, the base plates, the mortise joints. He went down through the trapdoor to the lower hay chamber and came back up. He looked at the drainage outlet along the uphill wall, dry and clean. He did not cross to the center of the space. He stayed near the walls, near the entrance, in the way of a man who is willing to examine something without yet being willing to stand inside it and call it what it is. He asked Ingrid 3 questions: the wall thickness at the base, the specification of the tar paper layer, the diameter of the drainage pipe. She answered each one. He stood at the entrance a moment longer. Then he said, My son is taking on the North Pasture claim this spring. He will need a barn. He did not say, I was wrong. He did not say, this is what I should have done. He was 61 years old, and he had been right about enough things for long enough that wrong had a particular weight for him that it does not have for men who have been wrong more often. He stood at the entrance of the barn he had dismissed in the autumn, and he asked whether his son could learn. Ingrid said, tell him to come on a Saturday. Reimer nodded. He looked once more at the timber frame. Then he left. Henry Reimer came the following Saturday, and Per Lundgren came with him, and by midsummer Ingrid had taught the principles of earth and livestock construction to 15 people in that valley. She taught the mistakes as carefully as the methods. She taught the crack repair and the ventilation adjustment she had made twice before settling on the correct baffle position. She taught the sound test for loaded timber. She told them that the first version of anything she had built in that barn had been wrong, and that the second version had been better, and that they should expect the same. She did not charge for the teaching. I asked her about this. The spring after the hard winter, when she came to my yard for lumber for the addition, a second barn, detached, built by the same method, for a neighbor who had asked her to build it with them rather than simply teach them. She thought about how to answer. Then she said, my grandfather built the first barn like this. He learned it from someone before him. It came to me free through people who are dead. You cannot put a price on what the dead gave you freely. I wrote that down that evening. I have the paper still. The Agricultural Extension Office published a pamphlet in 1891 describing the earth and livestock barn in technical detail. The drainage calculation was slightly wrong. Underspecified pipe diameter for the heavier clay soils in the northern sand hills. Ingrid sent them a correction. They published a revised edition. Her name did not appear in either version. I wrote 2 letters to the office in Lincoln about this. The first received no reply. The second received a form letter thanking me for my interest in agricultural education in the Nebraska Territory. I kept both letters. I also kept the letter I had written and not sent, which said rather more than the letters I sent, and which I will not reproduce here because I am 74 and have learned that some letters are better kept than mailed. Ingrid died in March of 1907. She was 60 years old. Lars found her in her reading chair in the farmhouse on a morning when she had not come out to the barn at the usual hour, and the book in her lap was open to a page she had apparently been reading the night before, and she had gone from reading to not waking in the way that is, if you have the choice of ways to go, not the worst of them. She died in March, which was always the last serious month in a Sandhills winter, the month that felt like the winter's final argument before it conceded the season. She had spent 30 years preparing for March. The barn was standing 30 feet from the farmhouse when Lars found her, and the temperature inside it, as I have been told by the last person to measure it, was 42 degrees. I visited the barn for the last time in the autumn of 1919. I was 72, and the wagon ride out from Dunning took longer than it used to, and Lars, who met me there, was 53 and moved like a man who has been doing physical work for 35 years without pausing to consider the accumulation. We stood inside together for a while. The barn was 34 years old. The sod roof had required maintenance over those years. 2 sections replaced, the original crack along the western edge addressed twice more, but the structure itself, the thing beneath the maintenance, was unchanged. The timber frame that Lars had cut in 9 days in October of 1885 was sound. The mortise joints had not opened. The base plates, treated with pine pitch before installation, showed no rot at the contact surfaces. The temperature inside, on an October morning when the air outside was running at 38 degrees, was 41. I put my hand against the sod wall and held it there. It was the same temperature it had been the first time I stood in this space, in October of 1885, when I had stayed 10 minutes longer than I needed to and driven home thinking differently than I had driven out and said nothing useful for the next 5 months. Lars stood beside me and did not speak, because there was nothing to say that the wall was not already saying. We stayed until the light changed, which was not long. Then we went outside.